we've done it before. We've done pay rises in London Underground this year. We've done pay rises on ScotRail. We've done pay rises with the Wales government for Transport for Wales. We can do a deal.
If the bad weather doesn't stop you, the train strikes will. Millions will find their journeys impossible today thanks to another rail strike by the RMT. They say their members have rejected what they called a substandard offer from Network Rail. We'll be speaking to the RMT just after 8 and to Network Rail just after 9. But first, let's speak to the Transport Secretary, Mark Harper. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
The dispute's now been going for 6 months. You said at the weekend that the dire situation is not inevitable, but it does feel, I think, to many people listening this morning, inevitable. Your job as Transport Secretary is, I suppose, literally to keep the trains running. Do you worry that you're not doing your job? Your job is to get people from A to B, and you're not doing that at the moment.
Well, it's also my job, Stig, to look out for the interests of taxpayers, and there isn't a bottomless pit of taxpayers' money to put into the rail service. There was an enormous amount of support provided to the rail industry during the pandemic, totaling about £31 billion. And I've also got to look out for the public interest going forward to make sure there is a sustainable rail industry that can be kept going for the future. And that's why I was very keen to make sure there was a fair and reasonable offer put to rail workers. I met the trade unions to discuss this, and they have had a fair and reasonable offer, which has been accepted by Unite staff at Network Rail. The TSSA are recommending acceptance of that offer. It's just the RMT that are recommending that it be refused. But even with them recommending refusal, almost 40% of their staff actually voted in favour of it. So I think the tide is turning on public opinion, and people think that there is a fair pay offer on the table, and the trade unions should accept it.
With your keeping your interests on the taxpayer hat on, did you intervene with Network Rail? Do they want to offer 10% over 2 years, and you said no, that's too much?
No, quite the reverse. I made sure when I met with Mick Lynch, he wanted me to make sure there was both an improved offer, and an improved offer was made to the trade unions. And on the train operating company side of things, they hadn't had an offer. And again, a fair and reasonable offer was made. So look, the detailed negotiations on the necessary reforms that need to take place in the rail industry and the detail on the pay is obviously done by employers. But I want this dispute to be resolved. I made sure there was a fair and reasonable offer from Network Rail and the train operating companies. That's what's on the table, and I hope the RMT will accept it.
So at no point did Network Rail say, we want to offer more, and you said no?
Well, look, I've got to make sure we look out for the taxpayer here, and it's got to be a sustainable deal. And an improved offer was made to the workers in both Network Rail and the train operating companies. That's why one of the unions is actually recommending that the Network Rail offer is actually accepted.
I understand. I'm not trying to be difficult, but I'm just very interested. Did Network Rail say, we want to offer a bit more, and you intervened to say on behalf of the taxpayers, no? Did that happen?
No, Network Rail and the train operating companies are doing the detailed negotiations on reform and pay. And the detail of that is up to them. I made sure there was an improved pay offer, which I think most people listening to this will consider is very fair and reasonable. It's absolutely bang in line with what's, if anything, more generous than what is taking place in the private sector. And I think most people will think it's fair and reasonable. And that's why I hope the unions will accept it.
Mick Lynch said that in all the places where you don't run the railways, they have settled, that Wales, Scotland, Merseyrail and London. So he would say that you, the government, the Department of Transport, are the blocker here.
No, look, I think it's important that we've got to balance two things here. The rail industry has still got 20% of the people that used to use it haven't come back post-pandemic. 40% of those who used it for commuting haven't come back, which means the rail finances need to be got into shape. There isn't a bottomless pit of taxpayers' money, so there has to be reform as well as dealing with pay. And it's the reform that helps free up the savings that mean you can have a sustainable rail service, fair to the taxpayer, but also at a reasonable cost. And that's what has got to be balanced. And that's what we're trying to balance here. So we have the interests of rail workers, but also the travelling public that have to be taken into account.
Just finally on this point, are you worried that they could be striking their way to irrelevancy? That particularly in the southeast, where many people have office jobs and can just work from home, ultimately people will lose the habit of coming in on a train. It's a pain. It's not particularly good service very often. They're often cramped and people standing in each other's armpits. And actually working from home has been a mini revolution. At some point, if there's constant strikes, people might say, do you know what, I'm gonna forget the train service generally.
Well, look, I think that is a danger. And one of the points I made when I met the unions is I said I want a successful, thriving rail industry with good, well-paid jobs for the people that work in it and to serve passengers. But every time they go on strike, they drive people away from the railway, and some of those people will never come back, and that will therefore damage the rail industry going forward. That's why I hope they think again. And I think in their long-term interest, they've had a fair and reasonable pay offer. And it's not in the interests of the rail industry for these disputes to continue.
Railways, of course, not the only place where strikes are happening. There's a general feeling that many public sector things are not working. People are threatening to go on strike or actually going on strike. We've had we had Royal Mail on strike. We've got nurses going on strike. Doctors are thinking about going on strike. There's a whole raft of them. Are you worried that your government could actually be pictured as the government that let Britain run to a halt?
Well, look, I think I think if you just have to step back and go, why are some of these strikes happening? It's fairly clear. It's because inflation is high. Inflation has been driven at least partly by the war in Ukraine with the big spike in energy prices. And of course, that's making people worse off, which is why it's the government's #1 economic priority to get inflation under control and deal with it so that people can cope with the cost of living. And we've also obviously provided a huge amount of support to people to deal with energy prices. And we want to make sure we give people fair pay rises, but giving out inflation busting pay rises is both not affordable, but also it will end up embedding inflation into the system. Inflation hurts the poorest most. We want to get inflation under control and deal with it. And that's why we've got to balance fair pay rises for people, but also making sure they're affordable for the taxpayer.
And I think the obvious place for that where people will be concerned are nurses. Nurses have seen a real term pay cut of 7% over the last decade. So that's what they've experienced. Inflation is 11%, which makes them poorer, as you say. At some point, the government not just going to have to pony up and pay more money to nurses. That's probably what people want. It's what nurses want. Offering them 3% when they've had 7% loss over the last decade, when inflation is so high, is just not going to cut it.
Well, look, of course, we enormously value the work that nurses do. That's why last year, when there was a general freeze on public sector pay, we made sure that nurses got a 3% pay rise. And as you know, we have an independent pay review body in the health service, which looks at all of the facts. It takes evidence from the trade unions as well as the government and the employers. And we've accepted their recommendations in full. So nurses will get a pay rise of at least £1,400 this year. But, you know, the 19% pay increase that nurses are demanding simply isn't affordable. It would cost £10 billion and would take a huge amount of money away from frontline care. So again, we've got to balance rewarding nurses for the fantastic job they do, but also making sure that those pay rises are affordable.
Can't this board look at it again? Just finally, Mark, can't this board look at it again? They made the recommendations before inflation was so high. Is it not much to ask them to look at it again as a matter of urgency to help you? Say to them now, 3% look good at the beginning of the year. It looks terrible now. Could they not help you out by offering a different assessment now?
Well, look, I think the recommendations the pay review body made are fair. They also, by the way, allow more money to be given to those on the lowest incomes. But we have got to make sure these pay rises are affordable, because, you know, higher pay rises will come at the expense of money going into frontline patient care. So I think we've made reasonable offers. On the health service, we've accepted what the independent pay review bodies have recommended, but obviously we're very happy to continue listening to the nurses, which is why the health secretary met them only yesterday.
Yeah, it didn't go very well, that meeting, but we can talk about that some other time.
Let's talk now to John Leach, Assistant General Secretary at the RMT, and he's at Euston Station in London. Good morning to you, John. John, can you hear me?
Thanks for having me on.
You're very welcome. I don't know if you managed to hear, you've probably heard it all before, I'm sure, the Secretary of State for Transport, Mark Harper there. So one of the questions perhaps that our listeners will be wondering about will be, how come some unions have accepted the offer, but the RMT has not?
Okay, so let's deal with the facts. You're talking about Unite, great friends of ours in the trade union movement, but on Network Rail, and on the railways at large, they are a very small union, and we have got 40,000 members, and the offers that we've been offered are not acceptable to us. So it's not like for like, and we have decided that we for our referendum to reject it. The membership have had a vote. That's loud and clear. And also on the train operating company side of the dispute, the strings attached are so horrendous, closing every ticket office, wholesale fire and rehire, and the removal of guards off trains, that we couldn't even possibly entertain it. All of this in return for massively below inflation pay rises. So we are where we are, and we're determined to secure a good deal for our members.
Is the message loud and clear? Mark Harper said that within the RMT, members who voted, 40% apparently wanted to accept the offer.
We had an 86% turnout and well over, massive figures voted against accepting this deal. He really ought to concentrate on the fact that the members voted to reject it rather than try and score points around figures. We are determined to secure for our members a good deal. He needs to empower the negotiators in Network Rail and in the train operating companies to come to the table, sit down, negotiate a settlement, a fair pay rise, and we can negotiate modernisation and changes that are safe and acceptable to our members. And he needs to stop playing politics with the railways in this country. People are sick to death of it, frankly.
Okay, but just so that we are clear, John, again, because, not everyone who's listening will know what the figures were. 86% turnout. How many voted to accept and how many voted to reject?
63% voted to reject,
yeah,
and the other percentage voted to accept it. But that doesn't matter. The reality is it was a no vote. People voted to reject it. And why can't we just concentrate then on getting back around the table and hammering out a proper deal for our members? The management need to be given the green light by the government to negotiate. But we've got a government that's hell-bent on making public servants, in my case, railway people, the National Health Service, education's coming down the line, firefighters, pay the price for their economic incompetence, and it's not acceptable.
So let's look at what they had offered, a 5% pay rise this year and a 4% rise next year. Mick Lynch, your boss, says the deal is substandard. And as you say, 63% rejected the deal. What do you want those numbers to be?
We have to have numbers that relate to the cost of living crisis in Britain today. I am not going to negotiate with yourself on behalf of Network Rail or the Trocs. I know you're not trying to do that, by the way. I'm not being
no, that's okay. I understand.
I wish they would come and talk to us, but they don't want to and negotiate properly. But what we're looking for is a proper cost of living pay rise. So we negotiate around a formula which is based around RPI, and for that, we can do some kind of package deal. We've done it before. We've done pay rises in London Underground this year. We've done pay rises on ScotRail. We've done pay rises with the Wales government for Transport for Wales. We can do a deal, and we've got a proven track record of that. But this government doesn't want a deal. What it wants to do is hammer working people into the floor for their economic incompetence and make us pay the price. And we're not having it.
John, you know what they say? They say, well, you probably heard Mark Harper, there is not a bottomless pit of money. We gave the railways £31 billion during the pandemic of help. This is a fair and reasonable offer.
Yeah. Well, they might have given the railway companies all that money. And of course, £500 million a year profit still made off of the railway. But our members haven't had a pay rise for 3 years, actually. So I don't know what he's talking about. And, inflation has gone up and up and up. And therefore, Mr. Harper's spin on things is, not really fair, is it? What we're looking for is a pay rise when people haven't had a pay rise for 2 or 3 years. We're looking for people to have job security in these economic hard times. We're not going for another P&O where people are sacked by email. We're not going to allow guards to be taken off trains. And another feature here is they're talking about 1,200 jobs being sucked out of Network Rail in maintenance, which would mean a less safe maintenance regime. And why would we, as people that represent people who work on that railway, agree to that? We've got a long way to go, but we are absolutely determined to get a good deal for our members.
Well, finally, on that point, you say you've got a long way to go. It's been 6 months this has been going on for, and who knows how much longer it's going to go on for, because the two sides, you do seem very far apart. Are you concerned at all, John, that strike action on the railways, while it inconveniences a lot of people, there's less inconvenience involved in a rail strike these days than there was 10 years ago, even 3 years ago, because 20% of people who used to use the trains don't anymore because of the pandemic.
Yeah, well, I mean, we are concerned about passenger usage dropping off, but there's plenty of people using the trains. The problem we've got at the moment, especially where I am here at Euston on the West Coast Main Line, it's in complete disarray. The railway industry in this country is in need of an instantaneous radical overhaul and fix all at the same time, as well as a fair deal for our members. We are doing our job as a union, representing our members. Our members, the fantastic men and women who keep Britain moving, just want to be allowed to come to work and get on with that. And that's the message from today. But we have to we cannot allow our members to be made to pay the price for this government's economic incompetence. It's just not right.
Let's speak now to the third part of this exchange. Really, you've got the government, you've got the union, and we can now speak to Andrew Haines, who's the boss of Network Rail. Good morning to you.
Good morning.
At what point do you look at the fact this is 6 months going on and to whom do you ascribe blame, I suppose, for 6 months of negotiation, fruitless negotiation, and we still feel a long way away from this being settled?
Well, look, I don't think this is a blame game. I don't think that helps anyone. We've got to find a way through it. I would observe that we've managed to find a way through now with 2 trade unions. And the RMT are the outliers here. But look, this is a devastating time for Britain's railways. We should be welcoming people back to the railway, welcoming new people over this Christmas period. And instead, we've got 4 weeks of very extensive disruption. That's going to do real harm. And it's not in anyone's interest for these strikes to carry on.
Did you you made a pay offer of 5% and 4% over 2 years, so that's 9% total, we count it as 5 and 4, I suppose. The unions have said you then added to that a whole bunch of strings attached, things like removing guards and changes to working practices. What do you say to that you're not dealing in good faith? You've made an offer, but you've also tried to caveat it somewhat.
Yeah, but look, I think it's important to clarify that there are 15 different disputes going on here. And the RMT are the common factor in those. I think the guards is relating to the train operators disputes, or some of those at least. That's not an issue for us at Network Rail.
Okay.
We've always said that our deal is subject to reform of working practices, but that's always been the case. We've been very transparent about that over the last 2 years. And we've spoken very extensively to the RMT about that, had very detailed negotiations. We've not made any last minute impositions or any additional demands in that context. Far from it. We put a enhanced offer on the table, and the RMT's response to that was to call additional strikes. So, I was really, really bemused, as well as sort of really disheartened by that action.
You talked about 1,900 job losses, which you say could happen voluntarily. There would be no compulsory redundancy. One of the things that's often said, and we heard it from John Leach earlier, I think, that if you take 1,900 jobs out of the railway, you will be damaging safety. There is no way of safely removing 1,900 jobs from the railway.
That's simply not true. We have an independent safety regulator that absolutely will validate every part of that move. But the working practices we're looking to change have been in place since the 1970s, and technology has moved on massively in that 50 years. And that's why we're able to do it. We've had over 3,000 requests for voluntary redundancy, so we know we can deliver those 1,900 savings without any compulsory redundancies whatsoever. And technology in the last 50 years, we've seen it in every other part of our economy, in terms of how radio shows are developed, in terms of car manufacturing, in terms of retailing. Everywhere else has been able to embrace that technology. And I think it's not credible to say that the railways need to stick with 1970s working practices and reject that technology. It's why we will be held back when we should be playing a bigger part in a green economy for Britain. But all the time we have unnecessary cost. We're not going to play that part fully. And I think that is, for me, that is a massively important moral issue.
As we report that the government stopped you from offering 10% pay rises, maybe 5 and 5 rather than 5 and 4. What's the role of government been for you? Have they stopped you making a more generous pay offer?
Look, the government is up front and is our shareholder, effectively. They act on behalf of the taxpayer. But the RMT have been helpfully clear. Yesterday, they put out a note saying they reject the principles of maintenance reform. And that is the thing that is at the heart of our inability to get a deal, not government intervention. They've been very explicit themselves in writing. That is the blocker. So it's a complete red herring to suggest that government intervention is the thing that's holding us up here.
I understand.
Yes,
But has there been government? I guess the question, whether a red herring or no, has there been government intervention? Has the government said to you, you can't go to 10%?
No, look, what the government has been very clear with us that we've got to be able to afford a deal, and that has got to be delivered through reform. And that's the conversations we're having: is how much reform can we agree, and how much of a pay award can that then fund? That's the conversation we've been having, not about any sort of artificial caps or constraints from the government.
Is it true that you had an 8% pay rise in the last year, and therefore that's the sort of pay rise that you think other people might reasonably ask for?
Look, thank you for allowing me to clarify. That is simply not true. I haven't had any pay rise since day one in this job. What happened was I voluntarily took a pay cut as part of COVID, and my pay was then restored. So no, my pay has gone down in the last 4 years. It's not gone up at all. And I wouldn't expect other people to do that, because obviously I'm handsomely paid, but I'm not in any sense setting a bad precedent.
In the end, how does this end? Just finally, how long is this going to go on for? How does this end because you pay more money, or you concede something on working practice? How does this get to a conclusion, do you think?
Well, most of these disputes end through compromise. But the thing that I find deeply concerning is, as I said, the RMT, in response to our improved offer, called more strikes. So that doesn't say to me that they're in the mood to compromise. So it may go on for quite some time. We, of course, want to talk to them. We want to find a way through this. But the signals the RMT are sending at the moment don't suggest to me they're in a mood to compromise. So I wouldn't like to say how long this can carry on.
And is it true that you can still make money even when there's strikes? The government guarantees your income. Is that true?
Well, we don't make money at all as Network Rail because we're a public body. We make no profits. We have no shareholders other than taxpayers.
But the government has to support you in this period because you have to carry on going.
Well, no, and there will come a point where if we can't fund the cost of operation, then we will have to make further efficiencies. That may mean job cuts. The government will not fund us indefinitely for this industrial action. They've been very clear on that.
So actually, there is a bit of a sort of Damocles hanging over the unions here. That if this goes on for a lot longer, you might have to find efficiencies, which means that the offer gets less attractive for them.
Well, absolutely, and moreover, of course, the win-win here is for people to be using the railway more, to be paying their fares incomes, and for that to facilitate a growing railway and better jobs. All the time we're alienating passengers and potential passengers and freight users. We're shrinking the size of the pot, and that's the most devastating part of this. People want to use the rail system. They've come back to the rail system post-COVID, albeit with different travel patterns. Now is the time when we ought to be putting our best face forward and saying, we are the greenest form of public transport in Britain, bar none. We can run a good service. We can run a service that goes from the length of the breadth of the country. You come and try the railway. And instead, we're saying we're shut for business. And that is devastating and the wrong long-term choice.